Hi everyone, so today we are going to be able to find angles of elevation and depression given trig ratios. So let's look at this picture. So here we have Kristen and Steve, and they are on top of the Willis Tower and on top of the John Hancock Center, and they're looking through telescopes at each other. Now, they do both have horizontal lines of sight, and when we're looking at Kristen, her horizontal line of sight, and then also when she looks up to Steve, that angle is called the angle of elevation. Now, when you have Steve and he has his horizontal line of sight, also looking down towards Kristen, that angle that is formed is called the angle of depression. Now, we want to think about why the angles are the same. So think back to geometry, and these angles are actually alternate interior angles. So the angle of depression will actually equal the angle of elevation. And we can use trig ratios to solve problems involving angles of elevation and depression. So here is an example of a water skiing ramp, and it rises at an angle of 15.1 degrees and it's 19 feet long. We want to find the height above the water that the skier leaves the ramp. Now in these questions, you typically might not be given a picture, but draw the picture the best that you can, and always remember that your picture will always include a right triangle. Now, in reference to your angle, you have two sides, x and 19, which are opposite, and hypotenuse, which we know from SOHCAHTOA is the so we're going to use sine. So we have sine of our angle is equal to x over 19. So what you can do is you can cross multiply. And remember that we are not going to multiply the 19 with the 15 and then take the sine of that answer. That is separate. So the sine of 15.1 and then that answer times 19. My final answer being 4.9, and then my units are in feet. Now here you have a pilot and is flying at an altitude, which is the same thing as height of 4.6 miles. Now along the ground, so the bottom or one of the legs of your right triangle, the plane is 16 miles from the airport. So we want to know what's the angle of depression from the plane to the airport. Remember, my angle of depression, I got my horizontal line of sight, and then looking down at, in this case, my airport, that forms my angle of depression. Remember, it is the same as my angle of elevation. So I do want to have my angle inside my triangle before I figure out which trig ratio I need to use. So in reference to your angle, I have the opposite and the adjacent, which I know is the TOA, or tangent. So I'm going to set up my trig ratio. Now, in order to find my angle, I do have to do the inverse trig function. So I have to do the inverse tangent of that 4.6 over 16, which simplifies to 16.0, and my units are degrees because I'm trying to find an angle. Here you have a support cable, stretches from the ground to the top of a 208-foot radio tower. So that hypotenuse is going to be that 250 feet. And I want to know what angle does it make with the ground. So the hypotenuse with the ground, which is along your leg. And again, we're looking at opposite and hypotenuse in reference to that angle, which I know is so. So the sine of theta is 208 over 250, taking the inverse sine of my fraction and simplifying, I get 56.3 degrees. Now, you are flying a kite 4 feet above the ground, so that's my height, 4 feet, and we are using 500 feet of line. So that's the hypotenuse. Now, if the kite is 372 feet above the ground, we want to know what is the measure of the angle of elevation. So that 372 is the kite all the way to the ground. We also have to consider when I make my triangle, that triangle, notice, is not right on the ground, okay? Because of that 4 feet, I have to take 4 feet away from that 372. So in my triangle, I technically have 368. Now, in reference to my angle, that 368's opposite, 500 is hypotenuse, which is so sine of theta of my 368 over 500, taking the inverse sine of my fraction, getting me an angle of 47.4 degrees. Now here are some things for you to remember. When you're finding your angle, do the inverse trig function in your calculator. If you forget to press the second and then, let's say, cosine, you're actually going to get a different answer. And remember, the angle of elevation and depression are congruent angles. Now, I hope this video was helpful and you're able to find angles of elevation and depression given a word problem and given certain trig ratios. Thanks for watching and see you next time.